Hello and welcome to this how-to video for Instant ID. In this video, I will be demonstrating how to integrate Instant ID with SOAP and REST web services. Web services have many use cases. The most common use case for integrating Instant ID to a web service is in the access control market. For example, a physical access control software platform which has its own web service API, which Instant ID would connect to, allowing Instant ID to enroll and save new records to the physical access control software platform, or search the physical access control software platform for existing records, produce cards for those records, and if needed, update those records and save them back. For the purposes of this demonstration, I am running two test web services locally on the same PC as Instant ID. On the left is a REST web service, and on the right is a SOAP web service. I have created two workflows which are on my home screen, which will eventually be used with the web services once I configure them in Instant ID. In order to connect Instant ID to the web service, we need to create a web service data source configuration. Click on the gear icon, Settings, Data Sources, Web Services, and then click on Create. I'm going to configure my REST web service configuration first. Give the configuration a name. There is only one type to choose from, generic. Select the web service type, in this case REST. Then enter the URL for the web service you are connecting to. This can be provided by your web service administrator or the provider of the web service. There are four options to choose from for authenticating to the web service. The option you choose and the details required to configure that authentication option can be provided by your web service administrator or the provider of the web service. For my test REST web service, I'm using a user ID and password. Once all details are entered, click the Test Configuration button and then click Save. Next, I configure the SOAP web service configuration. I select SOAP from the drop-down list. I enter the URL of the SOAP web service. I select my authentication method, then click Test Configuration and Save. Next, we need to configure the workflows to use the web service configurations we have just created. I will configure the REST workflow first. Click on Design, Workflows, the pencil icon next to the workflow you wish to configure, and you have two options for using the web service within the workflow. You can either use the web service interface step, which should be used if you wish to use the web service as a secondary data source, with your workflow already connected to a primary data source in the workflow properties. For example, your workflow may be connected to a SQL database and you wish to search that database for a record and produce a card for the record. You then may wish to save the record and details retrieved from the card at the time of personalization to the web service. The second method for connecting a workflow to the web service is via the workflow properties. This method is used if the web service will be the primary data source for the workflow. For my demonstration, I will be searching the REST web service for existing records and also adding new records to the web service. Within the Data Sources section of the properties, deselect the Use Primary Data Source checkbox, select Web Service from the Data Source Type drop-down, and then select your web service configuration. In the Search URL box and the Read URL box, you can see the web service URL you entered at the time of configuring the web service. Instant ID supports the use of 3 verbs with REST web services. The GET verb is used to retrieve records. The PUT verb is used to update an existing record. And the POST verb is used to insert a new record. As I am currently configuring the data source for the workflow, I will select GET as I wish to retrieve records from the source. Next, you need to enter a value into the box provided. This value is added to the search URL and is used to retrieve a list of employees in the web service. The value I have entered is correct for my web service. Your value can be provided by your web service administrator or the provider of the web service. For the read URL verb, we again select GET to retrieve records, and in the read URL box we add a value. This value is the information that will be passed back to the web service and determines the data we will see. The following value is correct for my web service. For the value that you need to use, please refer to your web service administrator or the web service provider. Next, we need to configure the target data source so that we can save data back to the web service. So we select web service as the data source type, and again select your REST web service configuration. For my demonstration, I wish to insert new records, so I select POST as the verb, and we enter a value into the right URL box, which will be used to insert new records into the web service. For the correct value to use for your web service, please refer to your web service administrator or the web service provider. In the Search Configuration section, choose the fields that you wish to be displayed for the records that are retrieved from the web service. Lastly, save your changes. In the Field Connection screen, we need to connect the fields between our workflow and the web service. Web services use input and output parameters for both the source and the target. For the REST web service I am using, we need to add these parameters. The only parameter currently provided is the ID parameter, which we configured in the workflow data sources. Begin by adding output parameters for the source. These are the fields which will be displayed when a record is retrieved from the web service. And connect these fields to your workflow fields. It is important to save your changes in between each configuration of parameters. Next, configure your data source input parameters, which are the fields that will be used to search the web service. This particular REST web service only supports the ID field, and save your change. Next, switch to the target data source and configure your input parameters which are the fields for the data that you wish to save to the web service. There is no need for me to configure output parameters for the target, as I am only saving records to the target web service. With configuration complete, I can now use my workflow to search the web service. I can select a record, and I can produce a card for the record. I can also use my workflow to enroll a new record and save it to the web service. During enrollment of the new record, I did not enter a value for the ID field. However, as you can see here, the ID field now has a value. This is because my test web service auto-generates the ID field value. Your web service may act differently. Now I will configure the SOAP workflow. In the Data Sources section of the Workflow Properties, select Web Service as the data source type, then select the SOAP Web Service configuration. SOAP Web Services use Web Services Description Language, which describes the functionality offered by a web service. It provides a machine-readable description of all the operations, how the service can be called, what parameters it expects, and what data structures it returns. These are the operations supported by the test SOAP web service I am using. For this demonstration, I will be using the getEmployees and getEmployee operations to retrieve records from the web service, and I will use the saveEmployee operation to update and save records back to the web service. So for the data source, I select getEmployees for the search operation and getEmployee for the read operation. For the target data source, I select web service and I select my SOAP web service configuration. Then I select Save Employee from the write operation. I then configure the fields that I wish to be displayed when searching records within the web service. In the Field Connection screen, when I select the SOAP workflow, we can see that we already have a list of output parameters. These parameters are provided by the getEmployees and getEmployee operations that we selected at the time of data source configuration within the workflow. We just need to connect these parameters with the fields in our workflow and save our changes. My SOAP web service does not provide any input parameters. Your web service might be different. For the target data source, we are provided a set of input parameters, which are retrieved by the Save Employee operation we selected at the time of configuring the workflow. The same operation provides a single output parameter, which needs to be connected to the workflow. With configuration complete, we can use our workflow to search the SOAP web service. We can also modify the data for an existing record and save that record back to the web service. Returning to the search screen displays the updated record. For further advice on configuration of web services, please refer to the built-in help section of Instant ID. That completes this demonstration. Thank you for watching.